Hello everyone. Today, Biker Justice Analyst bring you a story full of humanity and compassion. Enjoy listening.
Little girl beaten into a coma by her gambling aunt. A Hell's Angel saw and did this. The winter wind howled through the narrow streets, whipping snow into fierce swirls that stung like tiny needles against exposed skin. Vince O'Malley pulled his leather jacket tighter around his broad shoulders, his boots crunching heavily in the fresh powder as he made his way back from Mike's auto shop. The visit had been a waste of time. They didn't have the parts he needed for his Harley. "Damn weather," he muttered, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. His weathered face, lined with years of hard living, was partially protected by the upturned collar of his jacket, but the cold still bit at his cheeks and nose. The streetlights cast weak, yellow circles in the whiteout conditions, barely visible through the thick curtain of falling snow. Most people had the sense to stay inside on a night like this, but Vince had never been one to let weather dictate his movements. Still, even he had to admit this storm was particularly nasty. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. He ducked his head against another bitter gust, his thoughts already on the warm interior of his small house and the bottle of whiskey waiting for him there. The wind carried the distant sound of a car horn muffled by the heavy snowfall, reminding him just how quiet the world became during storms like this. Something caught his eye, a dark shape against the white landscape near the edge of a run-down house's yard. At first he thought it might be a garbage bag blown over by the wind, but something about it made him pause. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was just curiosity, but Vince found himself changing direction, moving closer to investigate. The shape became clearer as he approached, and his stomach turned to ice colder than the air around him. It wasn't a garbage bag at all. It was small, too small, with what looked like a thin jacket or coat wrapped around it. A child. "Hey!" he called out, his gruff voice carrying poorly in the howling wind. There was no response, no movement at all from the small figure lying face down in the snow. Vince's heavy boots moved faster now, eating up the distance in long strides. His heart, usually as steady as a drummer's beat, began to pound against his ribs. As he got closer, he could see more details that made his blood run cold. The unnatural way the child was lying, the thin summer jacket that was completely inadequate for this weather, and most disturbing of all, the complete lack of movement. He dropped to one knee beside the small form, his large, calloused hands gentle as he carefully turned the child over. It was a little girl, no more than 6 or 7 years old. Her face was pale as the snow around her, except for the angry purple bruises that marked her delicate features. Dried blood caked the corner of her mouth, and cuts, fresh ones, marked her forehead and cheeks. "Jesus Christ," Vince breathed, his rough fingers searching for a pulse in her tiny neck. It was there, but weak and thready, like a butterfly's wings beating against his fingertips. Without hesitation, he scooped her up into his arms, cursing violently under his breath at how light she was, how cold she felt, even through his leather jacket. Her head lolled against his chest, unresponsive, as he cradled her close to share what warmth he could. "Hold on, kid," he muttered, already turning toward where he'd parked his motorcycle. His long legs ate up the distance as he moved as quickly as he dared through the treacherous snow, his precious burden held tight against his chest. "Just hold on." The motorcycle's engine roared through the silent streets, its headlight cutting through the swirling snow like a knife. Vince had wrapped the little girl in his leather jacket, leaving himself exposed to the biting cold, but he barely felt it. His entire world had narrowed to the tiny bundle pressed against his chest and the road ahead. The child's face, what he could see of it, was a map of bruises and cuts that made his jaw clench tight. In his decades with the Hells Angels, Vince had seen his share of violence, but this was different. This was a kid, helpless and innocent. "Stay with me," he muttered, feeling her shallow breaths against his chest. His large hands, more used to working with engine parts than holding something so fragile, kept her secure as he navigated the treacherous roads. "Just a few more minutes, kid." The falling snow stung his face like tiny needles, but Vince barely noticed. His mind raced faster than his bike, filled with questions he couldn't answer. Who would leave a child out in weather like this? Who could hurt someone so small? He'd always lived by the code of minding his own business, keeping to himself, but something about finding this little girl had shaken him to his core. The hospital's emergency entrance finally came into view, its lights glowing like a beacon through the storm. Vince didn't bother with parking properly. He brought his bike right up to the emergency room doors, killing the engine with one hand while holding the girl with the other. "Need help here!" he bellowed as he burst through the doors, his voice bouncing off the sterile walls. The waiting room wasn't crowded. Nobody wanted to be out in this weather. But the few people there jumped at his sudden entrance. A nurse looked up, her eyes widening at the sight of the tattooed biker cradling a small child. To her credit, she didn't hesitate, immediately calling for assistance as she rushed forward. "Found her in the snow," Vince explained gruffly as medical staff converged on them. "She's got bruises all over, barely breathing." They whisked her away on a gurney, their voices urgent but professional as they rattled off medical terms Vince didn't understand. He stood there, suddenly feeling lost without the weight. In his arms, his wet clothes dripping onto the linoleum floor. The waiting room clock ticked away mercilessly as Vince paced back and forth, his heavy boots leaving wet tracks on the floor. Every time the double doors opened, he looked up, hoping for news. The other people in the waiting room gave him a wide berth, his imposing figure and agitated state making them nervous. Finally, after what felt like hours, a doctor emerged. Her face was grave as she approached him. "Are you the one who brought in the little girl?" she asked, consulting her clipboard. Vince nodded, his throat suddenly tight. "How is she?" "She's in a coma," the doctor said softly. "The injuries are extensive and consistent with severe physical abuse. There are older injuries too. This wasn't a one-time incident." Vince's fists clenched at his sides. The doctor continued, her voice professional but gentle. "We're doing everything we can, but I have to be honest. We're not sure if she'll pull through. The next 24 hours will be critical." Standing there in his wet clothes, still cold from the ride, Vince felt something he hadn't experienced in years. A deep, unexplainable connection to another human being. This little girl, whose name he didn't even know, had somehow worked her way past all his carefully constructed walls in the span of a single night. The doctor's pager beeped, and she hurried away, leaving Vince alone with his thoughts and the steady ticking of the waiting room clock. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the hospital waiting room as Vince slumped in an uncomfortable plastic chair. His leather jacket, still damp from the snow, creaked as he shifted position. The events of the night felt surreal, like a bad dream he couldn't shake off. A woman in a navy blue blazer approached him, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. "Mr. O'Malley?" she asked, consulting a notepad. "I'm Sarah Thompson from Social Services. I understand you're the one who found the little girl?" Vince nodded, his throat dry. "Yeah, that's right." Sarah sat down next to him, maintaining a professional distance. "Her name is Lily," she said softly. "She's 6 years old." Lily. The name hit Vince like a punch to the gut. Somehow, knowing her name made everything more real, more personal. She was living with her aunt, Deborah Carson, Sarah continued, her voice taking on a grimmer tone. We've had multiple reports about the situation, but she sighed, shuffling through her papers. The aunt has a severe gambling addiction. She'd leave Lily alone for days at a time while she went to casinos. When she'd lose, which was often, she'd take her frustrations out on Lily. Vince's hands clenched into fists. He'd seen his share of ugly things in life, but this made his blood boil. "Where's the aunt now?" he asked, his voice rough. "We don't know," Sarah admitted. "She hasn't been seen for several days. Given her history, she's probably at one of the casinos in the next state." She paused, studying Vince's reaction. "The police are looking for her." The weight of it all pressed down on Vince's chest. 6 years old. Just a baby, really. Left alone in that cold house, beaten when her aunt bothered to come home at all. Something about it touched a deep, buried part of him that he usually kept locked away. What'll happen to her? The question came out before he could stop it. Sarah's expression softened slightly. If she recovers, when she recovers, she corrected herself, she'll likely enter the foster care system, unless we can locate any other relatives. Vince nodded numbly, surprising himself with how much this information affected him. He was a loner by nature, had been for years. He fixed bikes, rode with his brothers, kept to himself. Kids weren't part of his world. So why did his chest ache at the thought of Lily being shuttled through the system? The hours crawled by. Nurses came and went, but there was no change in Lily's condition. Finally, around midnight, a different nurse approached him, her expression apologetic but firm. I'm sorry, sir, but visiting hours are long over. We've made an exception because of the circumstances, but you'll need to leave now. Vince wanted to argue, but he knew it would be pointless. He stood up, his joints stiff from sitting so long. I'll be back tomorrow, he said, though no one had asked. As he walked toward the exit, he made a decision. First thing tomorrow, he'd go to the police station. Maybe they had more information about Deborah Carson, something that would help make sense of this mess. He couldn't explain the pull he felt toward this situation, toward this child he'd never even spoken to. It wasn't like him to get involved, but something about Lily's story wouldn't let him walk away. The automatic doors slid open, letting in a blast of cold air. The storm had died down, but the night was still bitter. As Vince walked to his bike, that nagging feeling followed him. The unexplainable certainty that Lily needed him, somehow. Morning sunlight filtered through the hospital window, casting long shadows across the sterile room. Vince sat in a chair beside Lily's bed, his large frame making the furniture seem almost comically small. The steady beep of medical equipment filled the otherwise quiet room. Lily lay still, her small form nearly lost in the white hospital sheets. The bruises on her face had started turning various shades of purple and yellow. Her blonde hair, now clean and brushed by the nurses, spread across the pillow like a halo. Vince cleared his throat, feeling awkward. He'd never been much for talking, especially not to someone who couldn't answer back. But the doctors had mentioned that coma patients might be able to hear what was going on around them. "Hey, kid," he said gruffly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm the one who found you yesterday." He paused, rubbing his calloused hands together. "Name's Vince." The machines continued their rhythmic beeping. Lily's chest rose and fell softly with each breath. A bandage wrapped around her small arm where they'd placed the IV. "Look, I don't really know how this works," Vince continued, leaning forward in his chair. Never done anything like this before. But I want you to know you're not alone anymore. The words surprised him as they came out, but they felt right. He studied her face, noting how young and vulnerable she looked. I'm gonna help you, okay? Don't know exactly how yet, but I will. His voice grew stronger with conviction. Nobody's gonna hurt you again. I promise. The promise hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Vince ran a hand through his graying hair, wondering what had gotten into him. He'd spent decades keeping people at arm's length, and here he was, making promises to a little girl he barely knew. Hours passed as Vince sat there, sometimes talking softly about nothing in particular, sometimes just watching Lily breathe. The nurses came and went, checking vitals and adjusting equipment. They gave him gentle smiles, probably surprised to see such a rough-looking man showing such tenderness. As afternoon approached, Vince reluctantly stood to leave. His back ached from the uncomfortable chair, but he hardly noticed. At the nurse's station, he stopped to check if there had been any updates. A nurse with kind eyes looked up from her computer. "Mr. O'Malley?" she said, recognizing him. "I'm afraid we still haven't been able to reach Ms. Carson. We've tried all the numbers we have for her, but there's been no response." Vince's jaw tightened. "So what happens now?" "Well," the nurse hesitated. "Social services is involved, of course. But until Lily wakes up..." She left the sentence hanging. The uncertainty of it all hit Vince like a physical force. What would happen to Lily when she woke up? Would she just be thrown into the system, passed from one stranger to another? The thought made his stomach turn. He found himself rooted to the spot, unable to simply walk away. Despite having no experience with kids, despite feeling completely out of his depth, he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do something more. But what could a guy like him possibly offer a little girl who'd been through so much? The question followed him down the hospital corridor, weighing heavier with each step. Vince sat on his motorcycle outside the hospital, the engine cooling with soft metallic pings. The afternoon sun did little to warm the winter air, but he barely noticed the cold. His mind was too busy wrestling with thoughts he'd never expected to have. "What am I thinking?" he muttered, running a hand over his weathered face. The idea of him, a Hell's Angel with a reputation that made people cross the street when they saw him coming, taking care of a little girl, seemed ridiculous. He knew nothing about kids, let alone one who'd been through what Lily had. He kicked his bike into gear and rode through the city streets, trying to clear his head. The familiar rumble of the engine usually brought him peace, but today it didn't help. Every time he stopped at a traffic light, his thoughts returned to Lily's small form in that hospital bed. At a diner where he sometimes got coffee, Vince sat in a corner booth, staring into his cup. The waitress, Mary, who'd known him for years, noticed his distraction. "Everything okay, Vince?" she asked, coffee pot in hand. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world." Vince grunted. "You ever feel like you're supposed to do something, but it makes no sense?" Mary's lined face softened with understanding. "Those are usually the things most worth doing." Her words followed him as he left the diner. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the snow-covered streets. He found himself driving past the spot where he'd found Lily. The sight of the empty snowbank made his chest tighten. "This is crazy," he said to himself, but he was already turning his bike around, heading toward the downtown area where the social services office was located. The office was housed in a gray government building that looked as unwelcoming as it felt. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Vince approached the front desk. The woman behind it looked up, her eyes widening slightly at his appearance. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice careful. "Yeah," Vince said, clearing his throat. "I'm here about Lily Carson. I'm the one who found her yesterday." The woman directed him to a small office where a social worker named Ms. Thompson sat behind a desk covered in files. She was younger than Vince expected, but her eyes held a weary knowledge of how cruel the world could be. "Mr. O'Malley," she said, consulting her notes, "you want to take temporary custody of Lily?" "Look," Vince leaned forward in his chair, which creaked under his weight. "I know how this looks. I know I'm probably the last person you'd consider for something like this. But that little girl needs someone in her corner." Ms. Thompson studied him carefully. "Do you have any experience with children?" "No," Vince admitted. "But I know what it's like to be alone. To feel like nobody cares whether you live or die." His voice grew rougher. "I can't explain it, but I need to help her." The social worker was quiet for a long moment. Then she pulled out some forms from her desk. "This would be temporary custody only while she's in the hospital. You'd need to undergo background checks, home visits." "Whatever it takes," Vince said firmly. Ms. Thompson's expression softened slightly. "You know, Mr. O'Malley, sometimes the best caregivers are the ones who never planned to be one." She slid the forms across the desk. "Let's start with these." The winter wind howled outside as Vince pushed open his front door with his shoulder, cradling Lily's small form against his chest. The house was dark and cold, just like he'd left it that morning. He'd never minded the chill. Before, it was just him after all. But now, looking down at the pale face of the little girl in his arms, the coldness of his home felt wrong. He fumbled for the light switch, illuminating the sparse living room. His leather jacket hung on a hook by the door, and various motorcycle parts were scattered across the coffee table. The whole place smelled of motor oil and leather polish, nothing like what a child's home should smell like. "Let's get you somewhere warm," he muttered, more to himself than to Lily. The doctors had given him specific instructions about her care, but standing in his own living room, he felt completely lost. The fireplace hadn't been used in months, but he still had some wood stacked beside it. With careful movements, he laid Lily on the couch, making sure she was secure before he set about building a fire. His large hands, more accustomed to working with engine parts than kindling, carefully arranged the wood and paper. As the flames began to catch, casting a warm glow across the room, Vince looked around with new eyes. Everything seemed wrong now. Too hard, too sharp, too dirty. He'd brought home the few things the hospital had given him, some soft blankets, medical supplies, and a small stuffed bear that one of the nurses had contributed. He dragged his old recliner closer to the fireplace and arranged the blankets carefully, creating a makeshift bed. The stuffed bear looked oddly out of place among his belongings, its bright eyes staring up at him as if questioning his abilities. I know, he grumbled at the toy. "I'm not exactly father material." With gentle movements that would have surprised anyone who knew him, Vince lifted Lily from the couch and placed her in the reclined chair. He tucked the blankets around her small form, careful of the IV line the doctors had shown him how to manage. The stuffed bear found its place next to her pillow. The fire's warmth slowly filled the room as Vince stood back, studying his handiwork. Lily looked so small, so vulnerable. Her face was still marked with fading bruises, and even in sleep she seemed troubled. The doctors hadn't been sure when or if she would wake up. Vince ran a hand through his graying hair and sank onto the couch. His usual evening routine of tinkering with motorcycle parts or watching TV seemed impossible now. Instead, He found himself watching Lily's chest rise and fall with each breath, counting them like precious gems. "What am I doing?" he whispered to the quiet room. He was a man who lived alone, who preferred it that way. His life was built around freedom and solitude. Yet here he was, taking responsibility for a child he barely knew. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Vince's eyes grew heavy as he watched over Lily, but he couldn't bring himself to leave the room. He stretched out on the couch, his large frame barely fitting, and pulled an old blanket over himself. As sleep began to creep in, he found himself looking at Lily one more time. Something protective and fierce stirred in his chest, an unfamiliar feeling that both confused and comforted him. He drifted off to sleep with that new emotion settling into his heart, the sound of Lily's steady breathing mixing with the pop and crackle of the fire. The days blended together as winter's grip held firm. Vince settled into a routine he never thought possible. Each morning, he'd check Lily's vital signs just as the nurses had taught him, carefully noting everything in a worn notebook. His large hands, more used to gripping wrench handles than medicine droppers, had learned to be gentle with the medical equipment. The house still felt too quiet, too empty. But Vince filled the silence by talking to Lily throughout the day, explaining what he was doing as he went about his tasks. "Time to change your IV, kid," he'd say, or, "Let's get you comfortable." His gruff voice had softened over the days, though he'd never admit it to anyone. He'd made a few changes to the house. The motorcycle parts were cleared away, replaced by medical supplies, and the growing collection of children's books he'd borrowed from the library. The librarian, a kind elderly woman named Mrs. Peterson, had helped him pick out stories she thought would be good for a 6-year-old girl. "Kids in comas can still hear sometimes," she told him. "Reading to her might help." So Vince read. At first, he felt foolish, stumbling over words in simple children's stories. But as the days passed, he found himself getting better at it, even doing different voices for different characters. He'd sit in the chair next to Lily's bed, holding the colorful books awkwardly in his weathered hands. The fire was always burning now, keeping the house warm. Vince had hung thick curtains over the windows to keep out the winter chill, and he'd scrubbed the house from top to bottom, trying to get rid of the lingering smell of motor oil. It wasn't much, but it was starting to feel less like a bachelor's crash pad, and more like a home. One evening, as the snow fell softly outside, Vince sat in his usual spot next to Lily. The fire crackled in the background as he opened The Velveteen Rabbit, one of the books Mrs. Peterson had recommended. His voice was tired after a long day, but he read anyway, just like he had every night for the past week. "What is real?" asked the rabbit one day. Vince began, his rough voice gentling around the words. The story was about a stuffed rabbit becoming real through the love of a child, and something about it made his throat tight every time he read it. As he turned the page, something changed. There was a slight movement, so small he almost missed it. Vince paused mid-sentence, his heart suddenly pounding. Lily's fingers twitched ever so slightly, and her eyes fluttered beneath their lids. The book forgotten in his lap, Vince leaned forward, hardly daring to breathe. "Lily?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Her eyes fluttered again, her small face tightening in what might have been a grimace. Hope surged through him, powerful and overwhelming. It was the first movement she'd shown in a week, the first sign that somewhere inside she was still fighting. Vince's hands trembled as he reached for her small one, engulfing it in his calloused palm. He settled back in his chair, maintaining his gentle hold on her hand. The book lay open but unread on his lap as he watched her face intently, searching for any other signs of consciousness. The night grew deeper, but Vince didn't move from his vigil, afraid to miss any small sign of her waking. The morning sun had barely risen when Vince's phone rang. He grabbed it quickly, not wanting the sound to disturb Lily. His heart always jumped when the phone rang these days. It could be the hospital with news about her condition, or the social workers checking in. "Yeah," he answered gruffly, keeping his voice low. "Mr. O'Malley?" The voice was formal, professional. "This is Detective Martinez from the police department. We've located Deborah Wilson, Lily's aunt." Vince's stomach tightened. He glanced at Lily's small form on the bed, still peaceful in her coma. "Where was she?" he asked, his jaw clenching. "She was found in a motel just outside of town. Mr. O'Malley, I need to inform you that she's extremely upset about the current situation. She's making some serious accusations." The detective's words made Vince's blood run cold. He stepped into the kitchen, keeping one eye on Lily through the doorway. "What kind of accusations?" "She's claiming you kidnapped Lily. We've explained the circumstances, of course, how you found her and that everything was done legally through social services. But she's threatening legal action to regain custody." Vince's free hand curled into a fist. "She left that little girl to freeze to death," he growled, struggling to keep his voice down. "I understand your frustration, sir, but she is Lily's legal guardian. She's demanding to see her immediately." The words hit Vince like a physical blow. He'd known this was temporary, but hearing it made everything feel suddenly fragile. Before he could respond, there was a commotion in the background on the detective's end. "Where is he?" A woman's shrill voice cut through the phone line. "I want his address. That's my niece he has." "Ms. Wilson, please, calm down." The detective's voice became muffled. "Don't tell me to calm down!" Deborah screamed. Her voice became clearer as she apparently grabbed the phone. "Listen here, you biker trash. I'm coming from my niece, and if you've hurt one hair on her head—" Vince's grip tightened on the phone. "Like you did?" he said, his voice deadly quiet. "She was covered in bruises when I found her, left out in the snow like garbage." "You don't know anything," Deborah spat. "She's my responsibility, not yours. I'm her family." "Family doesn't do what you did to her." There was a pause, then Deborah's voice came back, dripping with venom. "I've got your address. I'm coming there right now." The line went dead. Vince stood in his kitchen, the phone still pressed to his ear as anger and fear warred inside him. He looked at Lily again, remembering how small and broken she'd looked in the snow. The thought of handing her back to Deborah made him physically sick. 20 minutes later, the sound of screeching tires broke the morning quiet. Car doors slammed, and angry footsteps pounded up his front walk. The pounding on his door was like gunshots in the silent house. "Open this door!" Deborah's voice rang out. "I know you're in there!" Vince took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. He opened the door to find a woman in her early 40s, her face twisted with rage. She tried to push past him immediately. "Where is she? Where's Lily?" Vince planted himself firmly in the doorway, his imposing frame blocking her entry. "You're not going near her." Deborah's eyes narrowed dangerously. "I'm her legal guardian. You can't stop me from taking her. I'll have the cops here so fast—" "Go ahead," Vince said quietly. "Call them. Let them see how you're acting. Let them ask where you've been while she's been fighting for her life." Deborah's face twisted into an ugly sneer as she glared up at Vince. "You think you can play daddy? Look at you. A Hell's Angel trying to raise a little girl. It's pathetic. Vince didn't move from the doorway. His voice remained steady, but there was steel beneath it. At least I didn't abandon her to freeze to death. I had important business to take care of. Deborah's hands shook as she jabbed a finger at his chest. You don't know anything about our situation. She's my flesh and blood. Business? Vince's jaw tightened. You mean gambling? The police told me about your habits, about the debt collectors showing up at your house while Lily was there alone. Deborah's face flushed red. That's none of your business. Who do you think you are, judging me? You're nothing but a criminal in leather. Maybe. Vince crossed his arms. But I've never hurt a child. Oh, please. Deborah laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think you can provide for her? Give her a proper home? Look at this dump. She gestured wildly at his modest house. You probably don't even have a real job. I own my own motorcycle repair shop, Vince said quietly. And, unlike you, I'm here, every day, making sure she's safe, warm, and cared for. Deborah's eyes narrowed to slits. You think you're so noble? Fine. We'll do this the legal way. I'm taking this to court, and when I'm done, you'll never see her again. Go ahead, Vince said, though his heart hammered in his chest. Let's show the judge exactly who you are. Let's tell them about how I found her that night, half dead in the snow. About the bruises all over her body. About how you were nowhere to be found. For a moment, something like shame flickered across Deborah's face, but it vanished quickly. You don't have a chance, she spat. I'm her family. The courts always side with family. You're just some stranger who thinks he can play hero. You're right about one thing, Vince said. I'm not her family. But I'm the one who's been by her bedside every night. I'm the one who reads to her, who makes sure she gets her medicine, who talks to her doctors. Where were you? Deborah took a step back, her lips curled in disgust. You fool. You actually care about her, don't you? Well, get ready to have your heart broken. My lawyer will destroy you in court. They'll dig up every piece of dirt they can find on you and your biker friends. She turned on her heel, stalking back to her car. Enjoy playing daddy while you can, she called over her shoulder. It won't last. Vince watched her drive away, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. When she was gone, he went back inside, closing the door quietly. He walked to Lily's bedside and sat down heavily in the chair beside her. I won't let her take you, he whispered, gently taking Lily's small hand in his. I promise. But as the afternoon wore on, doubt crept in. He knew Deborah was right about one thing. He didn't look good on paper. A Hell's Angel with a rough past trying to care for a little girl? The courts might not see past that. He spent the evening making phone calls, to social services, to the hospital, to the police. He needed documentation of Lily's condition when he found her, proof of Deborah's neglect. His coffee grew cold as he wrote down names, dates, and incidents, building a case piece by piece. Looking at the growing pile of notes, Vince felt both determined and afraid. He had to find a way to keep Lily safe. He had to prove that sometimes family wasn't about blood. It was about who showed up when it mattered most. The law office smelled like leather-bound books and coffee. Vince shifted uncomfortably in the plush chair, his weathered leather jacket creaking against the pristine upholstery. The secretary kept shooting nervous glances his way, probably wondering if he'd wandered into the wrong building by mistake. "Mr. O'Malley?" A woman in her 40s emerged from an office, extending her hand. "I'm Patricia Weber. Please, come in." Vince followed her inside, ducking his head slightly under the doorframe. The office walls were covered with diplomas and legal certificates that meant nothing to him. He sat down, feeling like a bull in a china shop. "So," Patricia said, opening a notepad, "tell me about Lily." For the next hour, Vince explained everything. His voice grew rough as he described finding Lily in the snow, the hospital visits, the coma, and Deborah's threats. Patricia listened carefully, taking notes and occasionally asking questions. "I know what I look like," Vince said finally, running a hand through his graying hair. "I know my background isn't perfect, but that little girl needs someone to fight for her." Patricia set down her pen. "Mr. O'Malley, custody cases are complex. The courts typically favor blood relatives, even when there's a history of neglect. We'll need to prove that Deborah is unfit and that you can provide a stable environment." "I own my own business," Vince said quickly. "I've got a house, savings. I can give Lily everything she needs." "That's good," Patricia nodded. "But we'll need more. Character witnesses, proof of Deborah's negligence, documentation of Lily's injuries. We'll need to show that you've been actively involved in her care and recovery." Vince pulled out a worn notebook from his jacket pocket. "I've been keeping track of everything. Doctors' names, medications, police reports about Deborah's gambling. Even got statements from some neighbors about how they'd see Lily alone at all hours." Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly as she flipped through his notes. "This is surprisingly thorough." "Had to be," Vince said simply. "For Lily." "The process won't be quick," Patricia warned. "These cases can take months. Deborah will likely fight hard, and her lawyer will try to paint you in the worst possible light." Vince's jaw tightened. "I don't care what they say about me. I just need to know if we have a chance." Patricia studied him for a long moment. "Yes, I think we do. But it won't be easy. We'll need to prepare for every possibility, and you'll need to be patient." The word patient made Vince want to punch something, but he nodded. "Whatever it takes." Later that night, Vince sat in his usual spot beside Lily's bed. The soft beeping of her monitors had become a familiar lullaby. He held her tiny hand in his calloused one, watching her chest rise and fall with each breath. "Got myself a fancy lawyer today, kid," he said softly. "Cost me an arm and a leg, but she's going to help us stay together." He squeezed her hand gently. "I know it's going to take time, but I'm not going anywhere. You just focus on getting better." The wind whistled outside, reminding him of the night he'd found her. Everything had changed since then. He'd changed. This little girl had somehow worked her way into his heart, and now he couldn't imagine life without her. The spring breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and blooming flowers. Vince watched from a park bench as Lily pedaled her new pink bicycle, training wheels clicking against the pavement. Her face scrunched in concentration, determined to master this new skill. "That's it! Keep going!" Vince called out, his heart swelling with pride. "You're doing great, kiddo!" 3 weeks had passed since Lily had fully awakened from her coma, and each day brought new surprises. The doctors had warned him about potential setbacks, but Lily proved to be remarkably resilient. Though she still struggled with nightmares and occasionally flinched at sudden movements, her progress was undeniable. Lily made a wobbly turn and headed back toward him, a small smile playing on her lips. These smiles were rare treasures that Vince had learned to cherish. Each one felt like a victory, a sign that the shadows of her past were slowly lifting. "Look at me!" she called out, her voice carrying across the park. It was still strange to hear her speak. For so long she had been silent, lost in her own world. Now her voice, though quiet, grew stronger each day. "I see you, sweetheart," Vince replied, the endearment falling naturally from his lips. Who would have thought that he, a hardened biker, would be sitting in a sunny park watching a little girl ride her bike? His brothers in the club would hardly recognize him now. After her ride, they shared sandwiches on a checkered blanket. Vince had learned to cut the crusts off just the way Lily liked them. She ate slowly, methodically, a habit he suspected came from times when meals weren't guaranteed. "Can we come back tomorrow?" Lily asked, brushing crumbs from her lap. "Sure thing," Vince nodded. "Maybe we can try taking one training wheel off soon. What do you think?" Lily considered this, her blue eyes serious. "Will you hold on to the bike?" "Promise. I won't let go until you're ready." That evening, they sat on the front porch of Vince's house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Vince had built a small swing there, and Lily gently rocked back and forth, her feet barely touching the wooden boards. "The stars are coming out," she observed, pointing upward. "Yeah, they are," Vince agreed, settling into his chair. These quiet moments had become his favorite part of the day. No lawyers, no paperwork, no worried glances from neighbors. Just him and Lily, finding peace in each other's company. Lily stopped swinging and turned to look at him. Her face held that serious expression she got when she was thinking hard about something. "Thank you for teaching me to ride the bike today," she said softly. Then, after a pause that seemed to stretch forever, she added, "Daddy?" Vince felt his breath catch in his throat. That single word, spoken so quietly, hit him like a thunderbolt. He looked at Lily, who was watching him carefully, perhaps uncertain of his reaction. His vision blurred slightly, and he had to clear his throat before he could speak. A smile spread across his face, even as he felt tears threatening to spill. He'd never thought of himself as the crying type, but lately his emotions seemed to have a mind of their own. The courthouse hallway felt suffocating. Vince's leather jacket, usually a source of comfort, seemed to weigh him down as he listened to the judge's decision. His lawyer's expression said it all before the words even came. "The court grants temporary custody to the child's aunt, Deborah Wilson," the judge announced, her voice echoing through the chamber. Vince's stomach dropped. The world around him blurred, and he gripped the wooden railing in front of him to steady himself. His lawyer placed a sympathetic hand on his shoulder, but Vince barely felt it. "Your Honor," his lawyer protested, "we have documentation of Ms. Wilson's history of neglect." "The court recognizes these concerns," the judge interrupted. "However, Ms. Wilson has completed a rehabilitation program and shown significant improvement. As the child's blood relative, she has primary consideration for custody." Vince watched as Deborah smiled smugly from across the courtroom. She wore a neat dress and had her hair perfectly styled. Nothing like the disheveled woman who had abandoned Lily months ago. Her act had worked perfectly on the judge. The drive home was silent. Lily sat in the back seat, clutching the stuffed bear Vince had given her. She hadn't said a word since they left the courthouse, but her eyes told him everything. They were wide with fear, darting around like a trapped animal's. Walking into their home felt different now. The walls that had witnessed their growing bond seemed to mock them. Lily's drawings on the refrigerator, her favorite cereal in the cupboard, the small pink bicycle leaning against the wall. Everything reminded him of what they were about to lose. "When do I have to go?" Lily's voice was barely a whisper as she stood in the living room still holding her bear. Vince knelt down to her level, his heart breaking. "Tomorrow morning, sweetheart. But listen to me." He gently lifted her chin so she would look at him. "This isn't over. I'm not giving up." Lily's lower lip trembled. "I don't want to go back there. Please don't make me go back." "Come here," Vince said, opening his arms. Lily rushed into them, burying her face in his shoulder. He could feel her small body shaking with sobs. He held her close, fighting back his own tears. The thought of sending her back to Deborah made him physically sick. He remembered finding Lily in the snow, barely alive, the bruises that had covered her tiny body, the weeks she spent in a coma. How could any court send her back to that? "I'm scared," Lily whispered against his shoulder. "I know, kiddo. I know." Vince stroked her hair, trying to memorize everything about this moment. The way she smelled like strawberry shampoo, the feel of her small hands clutching his shirt, the trust she placed in him, that he now felt he was betraying. But as he held her, something hardened inside him, a determination that went beyond anything he'd ever felt before. He might have lost this battle, but he wasn't about to lose the war. He'd fight with everything he had, every penny he could scrape together, every favor he could call in, every legal option available. "Listen to me," he said, pulling back slightly to look into her tear-stained face. "I promise you, I'm going to fix this. I don't care what it takes. I'm not letting you go. Not really. You understand?" Lily nodded, though fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Vince pulled her close again, his jaw set with determination. He wouldn't let her down. He couldn't. The morning after losing Lily,
Sat at his kitchen table, staring at the untouched coffee growing cold before him. The silence in the house was deafening. His eyes kept drifting to Lily's empty chair, her half-finished drawing still on the table where she'd left it. A knock at the door startled him. Mrs. Henderson, his elderly neighbor from across the street, stood there with a determined look on her face. "I saw what happened yesterday," she said, her voice firm. "It isn't right, and we all know it." Vince blinked, surprised. He'd barely spoken to his neighbors in all the years he'd lived here. "I've seen how you are with that child," Mrs. Henderson continued, "and I've seen plenty of Deborah Wilson's behavior too. The late-night parties, the strange men coming and going, the way she'd leave that poor girl alone for days." Something stirred in Vince's chest, a tiny spark of hope. "Would you be willing to make a statement about what you've seen?" "That's exactly why I'm here," she nodded, "and I'm not the only one." Throughout the day, more neighbors appeared at his door. Mr. Rodriguez from the corner house had security camera footage showing Deborah stumbling home drunk multiple times. The couple who ran the local grocery store remembered how Lily used to come in alone, trying to buy food with loose change. Even Tommy, the gruff mechanic who'd always seemed wary of Vince's biker background, showed up with documentation of the times Deborah had tried to pay for car repairs with bad checks. "Never liked how she treated that kid," Tommy muttered, handing over the paperwork. "You're doing right by her, Vince. We all see it." Vince spent hours collecting statements, evidence, and contact information. His kitchen table, usually empty except for coffee cups and motorcycle magazines, was now covered with papers and photographs. The breakthrough came that evening when Pastor Mike from the local church knocked on his door. Vince had never set foot in the church, but he'd seen the pastor around town. "I heard about what's happening," Pastor Mike said, settling into Vince's worn armchair. "I've had concerns about Deborah Wilson for years. She's come to the church several times asking for money, always with gambling debts hanging over her head. Vince leaned forward. "Would you be willing to testify to that?" "More than that," Pastor Mike replied. "I've been watching how you've changed since Lily came into your life. How you've become part of this community. The way you take her to the park, help her with her drawings, make sure she gets to her doctor's appointments. That's what real parenting looks like." The pastor's words hit Vince hard. He'd never thought about how others saw him with Lily. He'd just been doing what felt right. "I'll speak to the judge," Pastor Mike continued. "The court needs to hear from someone who can speak to character, not just blood relation. They need to understand that family isn't just about DNA. It's about love, commitment, and putting a child's needs first." For the first time since the court decision, Vince felt the weight on his shoulders lighten slightly. He looked at the pile of evidence on his table, at the faces of neighbors who'd stepped up to help. Maybe he wasn't as alone in this fight as he'd thought. Pastor Mike stood to leave, placing a steady hand on Vince's shoulder. "We'll get her back, Vince. This community stands behind you." Vince adjusted his borrowed tie for the 100th time, feeling like it was choking him. The courthouse loomed before him, its stone steps seeming to stretch endlessly upward. He'd traded his leather jacket for a suit that didn't quite fit, another loan from Pastor Mike. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he gripped his folder of evidence. "You've got this," Mrs. Henderson whispered beside him. She'd insisted on coming for moral support, along with several other neighbors who now formed a small crowd behind him. Inside the courthouse, the polished floors and echoing halls made Vince feel even more out of place. His heavy boots seemed too loud against the marble, drawing stares from passing lawyers in their perfectly pressed suits. But when he thought of Lily, none of that mattered. The courtroom doors opened, and his heart nearly stopped when he saw Deborah already seated at the other table. She wore an expensive-looking dress and had styled her hair carefully, looking nothing like the disheveled woman who'd threatened him weeks ago. Her lawyer, a sharp-featured man in an expensive suit, was arranging papers with practiced efficiency. Vince's own lawyer, a kind-faced woman named Sarah Mitchell, guided him to their table. "Remember what we discussed," she murmured. "Just speak from your heart when the time comes." The judge entered, and everyone rose. Judge Martinez had deep smile lines around her eyes, but her expression was stern as she reviewed the case files. The proceedings began with Deborah's lawyer presenting her case, painting her as a reformed woman who'd made mistakes but deserved another chance with her niece. Vince's hands clenched under the table as Deborah took the stand, her voice breaking at all the right moments as she described how much she missed Lily. She spoke about blood ties and family connections, making Vince feel like an outsider who'd stolen something that wasn't his. When it was their turn, Sarah called their witnesses one by one. Mr. Rodriguez presented his security footage. The grocery store owners described finding Lily alone and hungry. Pastor Mike spoke eloquently about Deborah's gambling history and Vince's transformation into a devoted father figure. Finally, it was Vince's turn to take the stand. His throat felt dry as he was sworn in, and for a moment, he forgot everything he'd planned to say. But then he thought of Lily, of her smile when she learned to ride a bike, of her quiet trust when she called him Daddy, of her peaceful, sleeping face when he tucked her in at night. "I know I'm not what most people would consider father material," he began, his gruff voice carrying across the silent courtroom. "I've spent most of my life alone, and I never thought I'd be sitting here fighting for custody of a child. But Lily..." His voice caught, and he had to take a deep breath before continuing. "Lily changed everything. When I found her in that snow, something inside me knew I couldn't walk away. She needed someone to protect her, to love her, to show her that not every adult in her life would hurt her. I'm not perfect, but I've learned. I've learned to make pancakes the way she likes them, to check under her bed for monsters, to hold her when she has nightmares about her past. He looked directly at Judge Martinez. I can't give her fancy clothes or a big house, but I can give her stability, love, and a home where she'll never have to be afraid again. That's got to count for something. The judge's expression remained unreadable as she listened, taking careful notes. When Vince finished, the courtroom stayed silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. All he could do now was wait, his heart pounding, for her decision. The courtroom remained silent as Judge Martinez cleared her throat. Vince's hands were clamped together so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Beside him, Sarah gave his arm a reassuring squeeze. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, Judge Martinez began, her voice steady and clear, and taking into account the testimonies of multiple community members, I have reached my decision. Vince's heart thundered in his chest. He couldn't look at Deborah, couldn't bear to see her smug expression. Instead, he focused on the small photo of Lily he'd been carrying in his pocket. The court finds that the best interest of the child, Lily, would be served by granting full custody to Vincent O'Malley. The words took a moment to sink in. Vince sat frozen, barely breathing, until Sarah nudged him gently. "You did it," she whispered. From across the aisle, there was a sharp intake of breath, followed by Deborah's angry protests. Her lawyer placed a restraining hand on her arm as Judge Martinez continued reading the terms of the custody agreement. Furthermore, given the documented history of neglect and abuse, Deborah Matthews will have no visitation rights until such time as she completes mandatory counseling and demonstrates significant improvement in her circumstances. Relief flooded through Vince's body, making his legs weak. He barely registered the rest of the judge's words as tears pricked at his eyes. Around him, his supporters, the neighbors who'd become like family, were smiling and patting his back. When the judge finished speaking, the courthouse clerk appeared with the final paperwork. Vince's hands shook as he signed the documents, making his signature messier than usual. Each stroke of the pen felt like another brick in the foundation of Lily's future. Mrs. Henderson had brought Lily to the courthouse, keeping her in a separate waiting room during the proceedings. As Vince stepped into the hallway, he saw her small figure sitting on a wooden bench, swinging her legs nervously. "Lily?" he called softly. She looked up, her face brightening. "Vince!" He knelt down as she ran to him, scooping her up in his arms. She felt so small, so precious against his chest. "Guess what, sweetheart?" he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're coming home with me. For good this time." Lily's arms tightened around his neck. "Really? Forever?" "Forever," he promised, holding her close. The word felt right, solid and true, like the weight of her in his arms. As they walked toward the courthouse doors, their makeshift family surrounded them. Pastor Mike beamed proudly, Mrs. Henderson wiped away tears, and Mr. Rodriguez gave Vince a hearty clap on the shoulder. Sunlight streamed through the tall courthouse windows, warming Vince's face as he carried Lily down the steps. She had her head tucked against his shoulder, her small hand clutching his shirt the way she did when she felt safe. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of nearby flowering trees. Vince paused at the bottom of the steps, adjusting Lily in his arms. She looked up at him with complete trust in her eyes, and he felt the full weight of what he'd just won. Not just custody, but the chance to give this little girl the life she deserved. The drive home felt different this time. Vince's old pickup truck rumbled down familiar streets, but everything seemed brighter somehow. In the passenger's seat, Lily clutched her favorite stuffed bear, a gift from Mrs. Henderson, and hummed softly to herself. "You hungry, kiddo?" Vince asked, glancing at her with a smile. Lily nodded eagerly. "Can we have pizza?" "Pizza it is," Vince chuckled, still amazed at how such a simple request could fill his heart with joy. "With extra cheese, just how you like it." They pulled into the driveway of their modest home. The house wasn't much. Weathered siding, a creaky porch, and mismatched curtains in the windows. But it was theirs, really theirs now. Vince had spent the past few weeks fixing it up, determined to make it a proper home for Lily. Inside, the changes were even more apparent. Gone were the stark walls and cluttered surfaces. Now, Lily's artwork decorated the refrigerator, and soft blankets draped over the couch. Her toys had their own corner in the living room, and a small bookshelf held her growing collection of stories. "Want to help me make the pizza?" Vince asked, setting his keys on the hook by the door, another new addition to their organized chaos. Lily's face lit up. She loved helping in the kitchen, even if it meant making a mess. "Can I put the cheese on?" "You're the cheese expert," Vince said, pulling out the ingredients they'd bought yesterday. He watched as Lily carefully washed her hands at the sink, standing on her special step stool. Such a simple action, but it reminded him how far they'd come from that snowy night when he'd found her. They worked together, Vince rolling out the dough while Lily arranged toppings. Some of the pepperoni pieces ended up in her mouth instead of on the pizza, making them both laugh. Flour dusted their clothes and the counter, but Vince didn't mind. These were the kinds of messes he'd learned to love. As the pizza baked, filling the house with its warm aroma, they sat on the porch swing. The evening air was cool and clear, perfect for stargazing. Lily snuggled against Vince's side, her small hand finding his larger one. "Look, Daddy," she pointed upward. "That bright one is moving." "That's a satellite," Vince explained, his heart swelling at her use of Daddy. It still felt new, precious every time she said it. "It's like a little machine that flies way up in space." "Higher than airplanes?" "Much higher." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one. Vince remembered nights spent alone on this same porch, feeling lost and purposeless. Now, with Lily's warm weight against him, those memories seemed to belong to a different person entirely. "Daddy?" Lily's voice was soft, sleepy. "Yeah, sweetheart?" "I'm glad you found me." Vince pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Me too, kiddo. Me too." The stars continued their silent dance above them, but Vince barely noticed. His attention was focused on the miracle beside him, this little girl who had changed everything. She had given his life meaning, filled his empty house with laughter, and taught him what it meant to be a father. The pizza timer dinged inside, breaking the peaceful moment. Lily jumped up, excited for their feast, while Vince followed more slowly, savoring the contentment that filled his heart. This was what he'd been searching for all along, even when he hadn't known it. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as Vince watched Lily carefully tie her shoelaces. She'd been practicing all week, determined to master this new skill. Her tongue poked out slightly in concentration, just like it did when she was drawing or helping him with simple repairs around the house. "Got it!" she exclaimed, beaming with pride. "That's my girl," Vince grinned, his heart warming at her accomplishment. These small victories meant everything now. "Ready for our morning walk?" They had started this routine a few months ago, weekend walks to explore their neighborhood. Sometimes they'd visit the local bakery, where Mrs. Patterson always saved a chocolate chip cookie for Lily. Other times they'd wander through the park, collecting interesting leaves or rocks that caught Lily's eye. Today, Lily skipped alongside him, her pink backpack bouncing with each step. She was different from the frightened child he'd found in the snow. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity, and her laugh came more easily now. "Can we go to the duck pond?" she asked, tugging at his hand.
Sure thing, kiddo. Vince let her lead the way, marveling at how naturally her small fingers intertwined with his. At the pond, they sat on their favorite bench, sharing the bread they'd brought for the ducks. Lily giggled as the birds waddled closer, competing for the chunks she tossed their way. "Remember when we first came here?" Vince asked softly. Lily nodded. "I was scared of the big ducks. And now look at you. You're the duck whisperer." She laughed at that, a sound that still amazed him every time he heard it. The first time she'd laughed, really laughed, had been during a pillow fight 3 months ago. The sound had caught them both by surprise, and Vince had to pretend he wasn't wiping away tears. After feeding the ducks, they walked to the playground. It was more crowded than usual, with several families enjoying the pleasant weather. Once, this would have made Lily withdraw, clinging to Vince's leg. But today, she watched the other children with interest. "Want to try the swings?" Vince suggested. "Can I play with them instead?" Lily pointed to a group of kids building a sandcastle. Vince's chest tightened with emotion. "Of course you can." He watched as Lily approached the group, her steps hesitant but determined. One of the girls, about Lily's age, looked up and smiled. "Want to help? We're making a princess castle." Lily glanced back at Vince, who gave her an encouraging nod. Soon, she was fully engaged in the construction project, adding her own creative touches to the castle walls. From his bench, Vince observed the transformation. Lily's shoulders relaxed, her movements became more confident, and her smile grew wider. She chatted with her new friends, sharing ideas and giggling at jokes he couldn't hear. A mother sitting nearby caught his eye and smiled knowingly. "First time letting them play with others?" "That obvious, huh?" Vince chuckled. "We've all been there," she said warmly. "It gets easier." Vince nodded, though his attention remained fixed on Lily. She was showing the other children how to make perfect turrets using a bucket and wet sand, a technique they'd practiced in their own backyard. Her face glowed with happiness as the other kids praised her idea. The sound of children's laughter filled the air, Lily's voice among them, clear, confident, and full of joy. Vince sat back, his heart full, watching his daughter bloom in the autumn sunlight. The peaceful morning shattered like glass when Vince heard the familiar screech of tires outside his house. He looked through the window and saw Deborah's beat-up sedan parked crookedly across his driveway. His jaw tightened as he watched her stumble out, her face twisted with anger. "Lily, go to your room, sweetie," he said quietly, keeping his voice steady. The little girl looked up from her coloring book, her eyes wide with recognition of the voice now shouting outside. She nodded and quickly disappeared down the hallway. The pounding on the front door made the windows rattle. "Open up, you worthless piece of trash!" Deborah's voice was shrill and slurred. Vince took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and opened the door. Deborah stood there, swaying slightly, her mascara smeared and her clothes disheveled. "Where is she?" Deborah demanded, trying to peer past him into the house. "Where's my niece?" "She's not your concern anymore, Deborah," Vince said firmly, blocking the doorway with his bulk. "The court made their decision. You lost your rights." "Rights?" she spat. "She's my blood."
You're nothing to her. Just some biker who thinks he can play daddy. She jabbed a finger at his chest. I'll fight you again. I'll take this back to court. I've got money now. I can get better lawyers. Vince noticed how her hands trembled, how her eyes couldn't quite focus. The gambling addiction was clearly still in control. The money you got from selling your house? The one you were supposed to be raising Lily in? Don't you dare judge me, Deborah's voice cracked. You don't know what it's like. I just need another chance. I can do better this time. Like you did before? Vince's voice remained level, but steel ran through his words. When you left her alone for days, when she ended up nearly frozen to death in the snow? Deborah's face contorted. That wasn't my fault. I just needed a little time. Just needed to win back what I lost. The court has all the evidence they need, Vince said. The neglect, the abuse, the abandonment. Nothing's changed, Deborah. You're still putting yourself first. I'll call my lawyer, she threatened, her voice rising hysterically. I'll tell them you're unfit, a criminal, a gang member. Vince didn't flinch. Go ahead. They already know everything about me. The difference is, I've changed. I put Lily first. Every decision, every day, it's all about what's best for her. She's mine, Deborah screamed, lunging forward. Vince caught her wrists easily, holding her at arm's length. No, she's not. She's not a possession, Deborah. She's a little girl who deserves to feel safe and loved. Tears streamed down Deborah's face, cutting tracks through her makeup. You can't keep her from me forever. I'll find a way. I'll get her back. The restraining order says different, Vince replied calmly. Now leave, before I have to call the police. Deborah staggered backward, her face twisting between rage and despair. This isn't over, she hissed, turning to stumble back to her car. Vince watched as she drove away, her car weaving slightly. He remained in the doorway until the vehicle disappeared around the corner, his expression unchanged. He knew she'd be back. People like Deborah never gave up easily. But he'd be ready, just like he was today. Vince stared at the note from Lily's teacher, his weathered hands gripping the paper a little too tightly. The words swam before his eyes. Lily is struggling to participate in group activities and seems withdrawn during class. Discussions. He glanced across the kitchen table where Lily sat, pushing her cereal around with her spoon. Dark circles under her eyes told him she hadn't been sleeping well again. The nightmares had returned last week, leaving her exhausted and jumpy. Hey, kiddo, he said softly, setting the note aside. Want to talk about school? Lily shrugged, not meeting his eyes. It's okay. Mrs. Thompson says you're having trouble with the other kids, he pressed gently. Is someone bothering you? She shook her head, but her lower lip trembled slightly. They ask too many questions. About before. Vince's heart clenched. Of course, kids could be curious, and sometimes cruel without meaning to be. They'd notice she was different, that she lived with someone who didn't look like a typical dad. Tell you what, he said, pulling his chair closer to hers. How about we practice some answers together? Things you can say when people get too nosy. Lily's eyes lifted to meet his, a glimmer of interest breaking through her sadness. Like what? Well, when someone asks why you live with me, you can just say, I'm your dad. Because that's the truth, isn't it? The important truth? A small smile tugged at her lips. Yeah. The next challenge came a few days later, when Lily developed a fever. Vince had never felt more helpless than watching her toss and turn in her bed, her forehead burning hot despite the children's medicine he'd given her. "Maybe we should go to the hospital," he muttered, pacing beside her bed.
No,
Lily whimpered, clutching her stuffed rabbit tighter.
please, Daddy, I don't want to.
He understood her fear of hospitals. She'd spent too much time in them already. But what if he made the wrong choice? What if she needed more help than he could give? After calling the pediatrician's after-hours line, he followed their instructions carefully. Cool compresses, plenty of fluids, and vigilant monitoring. He stayed by her side all night, telling her stories about motorcycles and far-off places until she finally drifted off to sleep. As the weeks passed, Vince learned to navigate parent-teacher conferences, doctor's appointments, and the daily routine of packing lunches and checking homework. It wasn't always smooth sailing. Sometimes he felt completely out of his depth, especially when Lily came home crying because someone had made fun of her second-hand clothes or her scary dad. But for every difficult moment, there were countless precious ones. The pride in her eyes when she showed him a good grade on her math test. The way she giggled when he attempted to braid her hair and failed miserably. The trust she showed when she came to him with her fears and worries, knowing he would listen. One particularly rough day, after dealing with a call from the school counselor and another nightmare-filled night, Vince sat heavily on the couch. He was exhausted, wondering if he was doing enough, being enough. Lily padded into the room in her pajamas, clutching her worn rabbit. Without a word, she climbed onto the couch beside him and leaned against his shoulder. Her small hand found his larger one, squeezing it gently. They sat there in comfortable silence, the weight of her trust and love settling around him like a warm blanket. For the first time since becoming a father, Vince felt completely at peace. Vince sat on his front porch, the wood creaking beneath his weight as he leaned back in his old rocking chair. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard, where Lily's bicycle lay on its side next to her scattered art supplies. Just a year ago, his porch had been empty except for his motorcycle tools and old parts. He smiled, remembering how stark and lifeless his house used to be. Now, crayon drawings covered his refrigerator, and stuffed animals had taken over the living room couch. His garage, once a temple to motorcycle maintenance, now shared space with a pink bicycle and training wheels. The changes weren't just in his home. His Hells Angels brothers had noticed the difference in him too. Gone were the late-night rides and bar gatherings. Instead, his evenings were filled with bedtime stories and helping with homework. Some of the guys teased him about going soft, but he saw the respect in their eyes when Lily ran up to hug him at their weekend barbecues. Running his hand over his graying beard, Vince thought about how his priorities had shifted. The freedom of the open road used to be everything to him. Now, his greatest joy came from watching Lily grow and heal. Every small victory, her first full night without nightmares, her first friend from school, her first genuine belly laugh, felt bigger than any adventure he'd ever had on his bike. The screen door creaked, and Lily emerged with 2 glasses of lemonade. She'd insisted on making it herself, though he'd had to help her reach the sugar on the top shelf. Her face beamed with pride as she carefully handed him a glass. "Thanks, kiddo," he said, taking a sip. It was too sweet, but he wouldn't have changed it for the world. She climbed into the chair next to him, her legs swinging freely.
Can we watch the sunset later, Daddy?
Of course we can. He reached over and smoothed her hair, still amazed at how natural these gentle gestures had become. The afternoon passed quietly. Vince worked on his motorcycle while Lily drew pictures nearby, occasionally asking him to explain what different tools were for. He found himself teaching her about engines and maintenance, something he never thought he'd share with anyone, let alone a little girl who soaked up the information like a sponge. As the day drew to a close, they settled back on the porch. The sky had turned into a canvas of oranges and pinks, the sun sinking slowly behind the distant trees. Lily leaned against his arm, her small hand finding his. The moment felt perfect. No words needed, just the comfort of being together. Vince looked down at his daughter, her face peaceful as she watched the changing colors in the sky. The tough, solitary biker he used to be seemed like a stranger now. This, being Lily's father, was who he was meant to be. The sun painted their faces in golden light as they sat together, two souls who had found each other in the darkest of circumstances, now sharing the simple joy of a beautiful sunset. In the growing twilight, Vince felt a deep sense of contentment. They had built something beautiful together, this little family of two, proving that sometimes the most precious things in life come from the most unexpected places. Vince stood in front of his bathroom mirror, running a comb through his graying beard. His reflection showed the same leather vest, the same tattoos snaking up his arms, but something was different in his eyes. The hardness that had been there for so many years had softened, replaced by a warmth he barely recognized. He could hear Lily humming in the kitchen as she poured her morning cereal. The sound made him smile, something he found himself doing more and more these days. Just last week, one of his old riding buddies had pointed it out during their monthly meetup. "Never thought I'd see the day when the Viper turned into a teddy bear," Jake had said, nudging him with an elbow. Usually, a comment like that would have earned someone a stern look, or worse. But Vince had just shrugged, knowing it was true. The nickname Viper, once worn like armor, felt less important now. Being Daddy meant so much more. Walking into the kitchen, he watched Lily carefully wipe up some spilled milk with a paper towel. She didn't need to be told anymore. She just did it. Pride swelled in his chest. A year ago, she'd been too scared to even move without permission. Now, she was confident, responsible, and growing stronger every day. "Good job with that spill, kiddo," he said, ruffling her hair as he passed. She beamed up at him, milk droplets still clinging to her chin. "I remembered what you said about cleaning up our own messes." Those words hit him hard. He'd said them offhandedly months ago, not thinking much of it. But she'd taken them to heart, just like she did with everything he taught her. It made him more mindful of his actions, his words, knowing that little eyes were always watching and learning. The morning routine had become sacred to him, making sure Lily had everything she needed for school, double-checking her backpack, asking about her homework. These simple acts filled him with a sense of purpose he'd never found on the open road. "Did you finish your math worksheet?" he asked, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Lily's face scrunched up. "Most of it, but the fractions are hard." "Want to look at it together?" She nodded eagerly, already pulling the worksheet from her folder. Vince sat down beside her at the kitchen table, pushing aside his coffee to focus on the numbers scattered across the page. Math had never been his strong suit, but he'd been studying up, determined to help Lily succeed where he had struggled. "Okay, so when we're adding fractions, what do we need to check first?" he asked, pointing to the first problem. "The bottoms," Lily declared confidently. "The denominators have to be the same." "That's my girl." Together, they worked through the problems, Vince guiding her with patience he never knew he possessed. Each time her face lit up with understanding, he felt a deeper sense of accomplishment than any motorcycle repair had ever given him. As Lily solved the last problem, tongue sticking out in concentration, Vince realized how far they'd both come. He'd learned to be gentle, to listen, to show love in 1,000 small ways. She'd learned to trust, to laugh, to be a kid again. They'd healed each other, one day at a time. "All done," Lily announced proudly, showing him the completed worksheet. "Let's check it over one more time," he said, pulling the paper closer. "Then we'll get you ready for school." Vince shifted uncomfortably in the small auditorium chair, his leather vest creaking against the plastic seat. Around him, other parents chatted quietly, holding programs and flowers. He glanced down at the crumpled program in his massive hands, reading Lily's name for the 100th time in the list of performers. The lights dimmed, and his heart started racing. He'd faced down rival gangs without breaking a sweat, but watching his little girl perform in front of all these people had his palms sweating. 2 rows ahead, a mother raised her camera, and Vince realized he should do the same. He fumbled with his phone, finally getting it ready just as the first group of children walked onto the stage. When Lily appeared, his breath caught in his throat. She wore a simple blue dress that they'd picked out together at the department store, her hair neatly braided the way the neighbor lady had shown him how to do. But it was her smile that got him, confident and bright, nothing like the terrified little girl he'd found in the snow 2 years ago. The piano music started, and Lily began to sing with her class. They were performing "Somewhere Over the Rainbow," and though there were 20 other kids on stage, Vince could only hear her voice. It wasn't perfect. She missed a few notes, and her voice wavered once or twice. But to him, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. His mind flashed back to the first time he'd heard her sing, just a quiet humming while she colored at the kitchen table. He'd been washing dishes, and the sound had made him drop a plate in surprise. Now, here she was, standing tall on a stage, singing her heart out. Vince noticed his vision getting blurry and quickly wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Jake and the boys would never let him live it down if they could see him now, the mighty viper crying at a children's recital. But he didn't care anymore about maintaining his tough image. As Lily hit the final note with her classmates, Vince was the first one on his feet, applauding so hard his hands hurt. A few nearby parents gave him startled looks at his enthusiasm, but he ignored them. His girl deserved every bit of that applause. After the performance, he waited in the crowded hallway outside the auditorium, holding the small bouquet of daisies he'd bought at the grocery store. When Lily came bounding out, her face flushed with excitement, she ran straight into his arms. "Did you see me, Daddy? Did you hear me singing?" she asked, bouncing up and down. "I sure did, sweetheart," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You were amazing up there." "I was scared at first," she admitted, burying her face in his vest. "But then I saw you in the audience, and I wasn't scared anymore." Vince wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. The daisies got slightly crushed between them, but neither seemed to mind. In that moment, feeling her small heart beating against his chest, he understood something profound. This love they shared, this pure, unconditional connection, was stronger than any force he'd ever known. It had transformed them both, healing old wounds and creating something beautiful from the broken pieces of their past. He hugged her tighter, his little girl who had taught him more about strength and courage than all his years on the road ever had. Vince sat at the kitchen table, watching Lily do her homework. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching the gold highlights in her hair. She'd grown so much in the past 2 years, not just in height, but in confidence and spirit. The scared little girl he'd found in the snow was now a bright, curious child who filled his days with joy. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Lily asked suddenly, looking up from her math worksheet. Vince chuckled, running a hand through his graying hair. "Think I'm already grown up, kiddo." No, I mean... She tapped her pencil against her chin thoughtfully. What else do you want to do, besides fixing motorcycles? The question caught him off guard. Before Lily, he'd never thought much about the future. Each day had been about survival, about maintaining his tough exterior. Now, he found himself dreaming of things he'd never considered before. Well, he said slowly, I've been thinking about maybe opening my own shop someday. A proper garage, you know? Something I could build up, maybe. He hesitated, then added softly, something I could leave to you, if you wanted it. Lily's eyes lit up. Really? You'd teach me about motorcycles? If that's what you want to learn, he said, smiling at her enthusiasm. But you can be anything you want to be, sweetheart. Doctor, teacher, artist. Sky's the limit. She got up from her chair and climbed into his lap, something she still did when she wanted to have a serious conversation. I want to help people, she said, her voice full of conviction. Like you helped me. Vince's heart swelled with pride and love. He wrapped his arms around her, remembering how tiny she'd felt when he'd first held her. You already help people, Lily. You help me every day. How? She asked, looking up at him with curious eyes. By being you, he said simply. By showing me what really matters in life. He cleared his throat, fighting back the emotion that always seemed close to the surface these days. Before you came along, I was just existing. Now I'm living. Lily snuggled closer, playing with one of the patches on his vest. Can we get a bigger house someday? One with a garden? That's the plan, Vince said, nodding. Been saving up. Maybe in a year or two we can start looking. Would you like that? Yes, she bounced excitedly. And can we get a dog? Vince laughed. One thing at a time, kiddo. But yeah, maybe we can think about that too. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in their thoughts about the future. Vince knew there would be challenges ahead. Middle school wasn't far off, and then there'd be teenage years to navigate. Sometimes the responsibilities still terrified him, but he'd learned that being scared didn't matter as much as being there. Daddy? Lily's voice was soft. Yeah? I'm glad you found me. Vince hugged her tighter, remembering that snowy night that had changed everything. Me too, sweetheart. Me too. Lily wiggled out of his lap and went back to her homework, humming quietly to herself. Vince watched her, marveling at how natural it felt now, this life they'd built together. Each day brought new challenges, new joys, new opportunities to learn and grow. But they faced it all together, this unlikely pair, the tough biker and the little girl who'd taught him how to love. The evening sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink as Vince and Lily sat on their weathered front porch. The old wooden swing creaked gently as they rocked back and forth, a comfortable silence between them. Lily's legs dangled, still not quite long enough to reach the floor, while Vince's boot occasionally pushed against the porch boards to keep their gentle motion going. Look at that cloud, Lily pointed, her small finger tracing the shape in the sky. It looks just like a motorcycle. Vince squinted, following her gesture. Sure does. Got the handlebars and everything. He smiled, remembering how scared she'd been of his bike at first. Now she begged for rides around the block, her arms wrapped tight around his waist, her delighted squeals carrying on the wind. The past 2 years had transformed their lives in ways neither could have imagined. Their house, once cold and stark, now held drawings on the fridge, colorful curtains in the windows, and photos of their adventures together covering the walls. Even Vince's appearance had softened somehow. Though he still wore his leather vest and kept his beard, his eyes carried a warmth that his fellow bikers often teased him about. "Remember when you taught me to ride my bike?" Lily asked, leaning against his arm. "I was so scared." "You were brave," Vince corrected her, patting her hand. "Just like you've always been." They watched as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. A cool breeze carried the scent of blooming jasmine from their neighbor's yard, and somewhere down the street a dog barked. These peaceful moments were Vince's favorite, when the world seemed to slow down just for them. "Katie from school asked me today why I don't have a mom," Lily said quietly, playing with the charm bracelet on her wrist, a birthday gift from Vince. "I told her I have something better. I have you." Vince's throat tightened with emotion. He remembered all the nights he'd stayed up wondering if he was enough, if he could really be what this little girl needed. But Lily had shown him, day after day, that love was enough. That family wasn't about who you were born to, but who chose to stay. "Daddy?" Lily's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Can we get ice cream after dinner?" Vince chuckled, the serious moment breaking as easily as it had come. "On a school night?" "Please?" She turned those big eyes on him, the ones that usually got her exactly what she wanted. "We could celebrate." "Celebrate what?" "Being us," she said simply, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. A laugh bubbled up from deep in Vince's chest, pure and genuine. It amazed him how this child could still surprise him, could still make his heart feel like it might burst with love. He watched as she jumped up from the swing, twirling in the last rays of sunlight, her dress spinning around her like a flower in bloom. Her laughter, clear and bright, filled the evening air. It was the sound of healing, of trust rebuilt, of love freely given and returned. Vince smiled, knowing with absolute certainty that he'd found his true purpose in life. They were more than guardian and ward, more than just two lonely souls who'd found each other in a snowstorm. They were family, bound by something stronger than blood, bound by choice, by love, by the simple truth that they belonged together. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.